Hello, everybody. This is another episode of Free Thought Blog's Podish-Sortacast, in which we try to put together a podcast with the operative word being try. Marks for effort, right? So today I'm hosting. I am Dr. Sarah of the Geeky Humanist blog on Free Thought Blogs, and with me here today is H.J. Hornbeck of, and let me get his blog name right for once, Reprobate Spreadsheet. Was that right?
That was indeed correct, yes.
Excellent. And sadly, I have no one else to introduce. It's just the two of us, and if the people watching us outnumber us, I'll be very happy. So, hello everybody. Today the topic is Know Better, Do Better, although it's just occurred to me I don't know if that's the exact title it was given. It's just the one I had for it in my mind. But it is about, it's something that came up in my mind when a few months back we did a podcast about problematic favourites and covering the general topic of people who do something or write something or make a program of something that on the one hand you really like it, on the other there is stuff about it that really makes you go, oh heck, did they write this? And that's the topic of one of our previous podcasts, I say, and it got me thinking about the subset of such people who then go on and actually try and do something a lot better in future. Maybe they've written something that you look back on 10 years later and think, well, yeah, that doesn't really sound so good these days. And they actually stand up and say so publicly and disavow it. They point out that this thing was perhaps not the best thing to have written or created. Or sometimes they try and use those reflections for future works they're doing, or sometimes we're talking about real life behaviour that people actually change and become better people. So that is a topic of tonight's blog post, tonight's podcast, or if you're in most other time zones apart from mine, today's podcast. So HJ, do you want to start us off with an example, or shall I do so?
Oh, I might as well. You've done a good enough job. You've done the intro and all that, so I'll take things over for a little bit anyway. I did actually have a couple of my ideas for who we could potentially talk about. Some of our initial discussions behind the scenes were actually literary. So one example I was, for instance, thinking of would be Neil Gaiman, mainly because he's actually made a number of changes to the Sandman TV series, which were quite different from the original series originally. He actually changed a number of characters from male to female. He introduced a number of black characters, whereas almost everybody before was white. It sort of, to me at least, suggests some idea that, hey, he has sort of recognized that his own writing wasn't necessarily all that diverse or interesting and all that, or wasn't all that as diverse as it could have been. Now, the main problem with bringing up Neil Gaiman as an example of that is I don't really have a lot of examples of him actually going back and connecting the dots on that and saying, oh, well, my prior work and all that, I got some things wrong and all that. The new stuff is better and all that. So it's kind of tough to actually sort of say, yes, for sure, this is exactly what he's done and all that. So
I think the thing is, this could be a case of actions speak louder. As you say, he's made changes to the Sandman going into film that I think are positive ones, and I think I don't necessarily need him to be making a speech about all this. The fact that he's doing it, and I like that.
Indeed, yeah.
Okay. Sorry, but did you have anything else you wanted to say about Neil Gaiman?
Well, no, other than he has actually been a very good advocate for basically various LGBT struggles and all that. He has openly spoken in favor of trans rights. Notable because there was some controversy around his wife and trans rights, I think a little while ago. But he himself has been fairly outspoken in that regard. And also actively pushing back against even some of his fans who are like, how dare you sort of transition over to this? He's like, no, I've always been like that. Conversely, I also tracked down an interview and all that where he declared he was fairly apolitical, and then in fact he sort of viewed himself as a centrist. But he thinks that he tends to be sort of viewed as progressive, simply because where he's from in Britain, their centrism would be considered far left within the United States. I don't quite buy it.
I think in the United States, they consider pretty much everywhere else as centrism far left, from what I have heard. But yes, I agree.
Yes,
So, mhm.
but I mean,
so
especially the whole Turf Island thing and all that. It's like I'm not
mm,
sure I necessarily buy that from him.
yeah. Right, thank you very much.
Mhm.
So I've also got a literary example, same sort of thing, but I think a little bit more overt. But I don't know to what extent people have heard of this author, but he is pretty widely known. Sorry, these are coming out in reverse, but these are two of the Percy Jackson series by Rick Riordan, young adult literature. Are you familiar with them at all, HJ?
I have heard of the name, but I could not tell you anything other than just, oh, I think I vaguely know who that author is.
Okay, right. This is a absolutely superb series. I completely love this guy's work, and it is about what would happen if the Greek gods and other gods were real, and they were still going round producing half blood demigod children, who were then growing up to have special powers and have to go out and fight monsters in the modern world today. And this started off with a 5 book series, which was the Percy Jackson series. It's Percy Jackson and this, Percy Jackson and that. That's probably the name that's most familiar to you. The early ones got made into films. Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief, that's the first one. And they are excellent books. They are funny, they're snarky, they're really good reads, they're hilarious. And they also have these kind of rather serious points about I mean, the characters in them are basically all, they have ADHD and dyslexia and keep getting into trouble at school for reasons they can't explain. And it's very much this, yes, the underdog who seems like they're a total loser can be a hero. And there are these wonderful, very positive messages for children in the books. But the first series, and I do want to say there's an excellent blog post out there by Anna Mardol, uh, um, uh, which I believe was called The Curse of the Smart Girl, which was discussing this. And, so shout out to Anna there. But the thing about the first series is it was very much Percy Jackson, clues in the name. Percy Jackson was the character, and so all these books basically ended up being about straight white guy saves the day and does all the good stuff. Straight white girl gets to be Hermione Granger type, as in providing him with advice and being a love interest, and everyone else is very much supporting cast. So that is like the big flaw of the first series. Now, I don't know whether Reardon figured this out for himself or whether someone sat him down and had a chat with him or what, but you can really see in all his subsequent series how hard he's tried to change that format, because going on to the next series, it's basically there's 7 different main characters. The plot line gets shared between all of them. Let me think. 3 of them are female. One is black on her human side. They're all demigods. They're all sons and daughters of gods and goddesses. But on their human side, one's black, one's Chinese, one's Puerto Rican. And oh yeah, and one's Native American. So good diversity lineup. And as for Percy, he's got a much smaller role to play. And in fact, one of the bits about his role is he actually has to learn to stand back and let other people get on with saving the day sometimes. So you've got a much more diverse cast, and the whole thing is about working together, and everyone's got a bit of the skill that it's going to take to get the job done. Everyone's got their moment in the sun. Same thing with subsequent books. You've got gay characters, bisexual characters. You've got in one of his series, he's got um, an elf who's deaf, so you have the disability inclusion. There's a gender fluid character in the same series who becomes a love interest. but is a lot more in the series, and just love interest. And it's just, comparing all of his subsequent series to the first one, you can see how much harder Rick Riordan has worked to actually put to actually make his books diverse and inclusive. And I just think that's absolutely wonderful. So shout out to Rick Riordan. I think you're brilliant. So, HJ, I
Mhm.
believe you had like one or two real life examples that sounded interesting for you to share.
Well, at last I heard Neil Gaiman was alive, so he does count as
Yeah,
that.
yeah, sorry, examples of what people are doing rather than just what they're writing. So, yes.
Yeah, but yes, as I alluded to, I was thinking of people who in other fields, since we had sort of started off with a very literary bent and all that. I'm like, okay, no, there's got to be examples outside the sort of literary thing. And one of the ideas that came to mind were people who were formerly part of the gender critical movement and sort of had since sort of realized that they had joined a hate group and had sort of come out of it. One of the more recent ones, which has made the headlines and all that, are a number of detransitioners. These were actually sort of pointed to by gender critical people as proof that, you know, there's a common belief within there that a large number of transgender people actually will detransition after a certain amount of time, sort of justifying the fact in their minds that being transgender is not real. And so they actually point to a small handful of people who actually did transition and then transition back to something else. And one of these people actually is Kai Shevers. She, in fact, I think transitioned around in 2012 and all that. Uh, went, sort of went on testosterone and all that to sort of promote sort of a masculine sort of appearance to herself. But over time, sort of realized that that wasn't really what she sort of felt like she identified with. And sort of, because of her doubts and all that, sort of went online to do a little bit of research and ran across, some people within the gender critical movement who sort of we realized, well, shoot, this is sort of this could be potentially a very good asset for us, and sort of ran in, and sort of tried to recruit her into their movement, and indeed succeeded in that regard. And so, she stopped taking testosterone and started speaking out about how she was sort of forcibly transitioned and all that, and blah blah blah. But she very quickly sort of got uncomfortable with the people that these gender critical people were teaming up with. Like she noticed a lot of far right Christian people, and she's like, whoa, wait a minute. I mean, I'm part of the LGBTQ community, I'm not really comfortable with you people teaming up. And for the most part, she was just met with a shrug. They didn't really care. As long as these people were promoting her story, that was perfectly fine. And so even when, her book was actually used by some people on the religious right, as, sort of talking about the evils of all this, she was just shocked that nobody else seemed to be sort of taking it seriously. And, with a lot of soul searching and all that, she sort of came to a different conclusion that she was contributing essentially to a hate movement of sorts. Well, I don't want to put words in her mouth. I don't think she actually uses the term hate movement. I certainly would call them that. But
Mm.
she realized that no,
But
this
she
is
realised it was problematic what she was contributing to.
very much so. These people were very much twisting the truth for an agenda, and they weren't really sort of coming to deal with just how closely it aligned with religious people who were opposed to LGBT rights. And so she
Mm.
actually sort of renounced her role within the movement itself and went back on testosterone, not to sort of transition back into being a man. She sort of realized that it wasn't that she wasn't sort of a woman or a man. She was, I think, transmasc, but
Mm.
was sort of non-binary. I'm trying to make sure
Mm.
I'm getting her sort of presentation right here. But yeah,
And is it she, her pronouns?
it is she, her pronouns. I'm sure of that one.
Thank you. Lovely.
Yes.
Thank you.
I did make sure to get that one right at least.
Thank you. Excellent.
But yes, she very much was like, okay, now I'm there's sort of this tendency, especially amongst cis people as well, to sort of push a gender binary and say that there is sort of a definite masculine and a definite feminine, and you must fall within those two bounds. If you are not in one group, you must be in the other. What
Mm.
Shriver was sort of realizing though is that wait a minute, I don't really fit into either group. I don't really sort of view. She didn't really view that there's a strict binary and all that. And so by sort of questioning her gender and all that, she sort of fell into the trap of thinking, well, if I'm not a woman, I must be a man, not realizing there's another option, neither.
Mm. Mm.
And so now
But
she's sort of back to, getting her sort of bearings and speaking out about the movement she was a part of.
mm, that is impressive. That but I'm impressed by the idea that you can align yourself publicly with a movement and then have the courage to stand up and say, actually, you know what, I was wrong, and I'm speaking out against um, the against what this group stands for. And I believe you mentioned you knew of someone else who'd done something similar, if I have this right.
Yes, indeed. I did find someone else similar. Someone who actually made a little bit more splash more recently. I want to make sure I'm getting her right. And yes, her pronouns too. I just made sure of
Mm-hmm.
that. Elsa Ray Shoup.
Mm.
Earlier this year, you may have actually seen news reports of a bunch of emails that were sort of leaked from sort of a gender critical sort of Christian rights kind of organization and all that. It was actually
I don't think I did.
no, it was a big news story within my circles, which may tell you more
Mm.
about my circles than anything else.
Mm, quite. Yeah, but I obviously missed this. Sorry to have missed it. Yeah, tell me
Oh
more.
no, no worries. Those were actually leaked by Shoup herself. She became fairly heavily embedded within the sort of the anti-LGBT movement and all that, the transphobic movement and all that, to the point of actually talking with a number of important people. I believe she actually talked with Ray Blanchard. I am
Mm.
sort of going from memory here, so I might have that wrong. But he's a very famous doctor within the gender studies field, most famous for promoting things like autogynephilia, essentially sort of arguing that transgender women are either transgender because they're attracted to womanhood. Yeah, basically just sort of trying to describe it as if it's purely sexual attraction, and only really having a theory for transgender women and all that. It's been debunked 5 ways to Sunday, but it still tends to be popular amongst gender critical folks and all that because it sort of smears, transgender women's in particular as sexual deviants. It's handy for that sort of narrative. The
Yeah,
whole
why let a
groomer.
little thing like evidence get in the way, hey?
Oh yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, she actually her story sort of begins, I think, roughly 2012. Hopefully, I'm not mistaking her and Shaver as well, but. Sheep, in her case, actually did undergo a full transition around then, and unfortunately, it really did not go well. Her hormones were not really well monitored and all that, and she got, fairly, she got a bunch of skin reactions and a bunch of other stuff. I'm reading a little bit from her, and just really was sort of grumpy about it and all that. She was still working for LGBT rights, and actually was partnered with sort of like a queer rights organization, Lambda Legal, actually, now that I think of it. But she sort of got, because of her own sort of rough transition and all that, she did wind up doing a bunch of research and all that, and wound up crossing paths with the gender critical movement and all that. And especially because of, her legal connections and all that, she sort of became a very important person within there. And they're often sort of looking for somebody to actually potentially be a test case for a legal case. And Shoup herself was willing to sort of volunteer for that, as a way to sort of roll back transgender rights in general and actually deny necessary health care to other transgender people. And the process, unfortunately, was really dehumanizing to her. Like, they literally did not sort of care about her story and all that. They basically just shoved documents at her and said, sign this thing, sort of attesting that this would happen to you. And even when she's kind of like, well, this isn't, quite right and all that, they're like, don't worry, just sign on the dotted line and all that. And, she became sort of this vehicle and very quickly was sort of, she was just sort of used for what she was, someone who had sort of a rough transition and sort of regretted it. And she felt very dehumanized and all that, to the point where even when she started to have mental health issues and all that, they just did not care. For the most, there was, I think, one or two sympathetic people, but generally speaking, all they cared about was that she would sign the documents to say that yes, this actually happened to me and all that, whether or not it actually sort of happened or not.
They just wanted her as a figurehead rather than as who she was.
Exactly. Generally just no care for that, and often sort of trying to dig up information and all that. I think there's one person who contacted her trying to be like, okay, we got to try and find evidence that transition actually leads to increased suicide and all that. And the evidence was sort of completely against it and still is. But they're
Mm,
desperately sort of trying to
really?
pick studies and look for anecdotes and all that, which might potentially support their cause. Essentially, sort of fishing for a story once they sort of knew what the conclusion was. In the end, though, after just basically being treated like shit by this movement and all that, she sort of realized, okay, enough is enough. And because she was fairly high up within this, because of her connections and her utility to that, she decided to actually go public and start leaking some of the emails she had with some of the higher ups in there. And they reveal sort of like a damning pattern of religious rights groups getting involved in this and sort of using it as a sort of a vehicle for pushing Christian perspectives into secular society. Like there's even like open calls for prayer and stuff in the emails that she's got, because these are religious loons, behind the scenes, sort of pushing for this thing. And it's kind of astonishing just how deep those ties have come. I had a blog post on this a couple of years ago, sort of pointing out the deep ties between the religious right and sort of the anti-LGBT movement, but they've only
Mm,
gotten stronger over time, sadly. It's
mm,
quite depressing in that regard. But yeah, in her case, there's also sort of like a level of sort of self-loathing in some sense. She was trying to deny other people access to hormones and all that. Well, she herself was kind of dependent on those hormones. And she was just badly treated. At first by the medical establishment, who really did not take proper care of her to sort of help her transition be as successful as possible, and then by
I'm
the gender
sorry.
critical
Mm,
movement, who just
mm,
openly exploited her for their own ends.
mm.
And
So this is so sad for her, but at the same time, again, I'm impressed that she found the courage to make something out of this in terms of exposing what was going on and having the courage to do that. So I think absolute kudos to her for her bravery and how she dealt with this.
it is, and she actually there's an excellent interview with her in Extra magazine, which I definitely recommend people read and all that. Unfortunately, she's sort of reached a point where she's really sort of burned her bridges on both sides. She was part of both the pro LGBTQ plus movement as well as the anti part, and both sides don't really sort of want much to do with her because of her associations with the other sides. So she's just kind of like, she sort of feels isolated and alone, sadly. But at least she is more in touch with herself, and is sort of coming to amends with, oh shoot, I did wrong. Here's one way I can actually sort of help out at the time.
Good for her.
Indeed.
Thank you. Very interesting. Thank you very much. And my thoughts and my commendations to those two brave women who've had the courage to stand up for something they found to be true, even though it went against what they'd previously thought. Right, so I'm going to mention another real life example, which is the recent stuff in the news about the Disney CEO versus everyone's favourite Ron DeSantis. Ugh. Sorry, I feel sort of slightly nauseated just from saying his name. Okay, so this is a story of which I know only the outline, but it was something I found fascinating because, you know, you think of Disney and their stance on gay rights. You would Disney's kind of traditionally been traditional. They've been the absolute uh, bastion of the right wing family values, quote family unquote values, and anti LGBT as she stands thing, very very heteronormative historically, and recently, was this late last year or sometime this year, uh, Disney CEO actually came out against what Ron DeSantis is trying to do in Florida, and came out publicly against what's known as a Don't Say Gay bill, which many of you will have heard of, which is trying to stop any sort of discussion of gay rights or any such thing, or gay support in schools. And so for Disney to actually come out publicly in support of that was a huge thing. And for them to and then they went on and actually held a Pride event publicly. And I'm still not saying that, they're not, they haven't done a 180 onto being a full supporter of woke culture or whatever, but you've got someone who is willing to actually stand up and give this support from someone who you think was very, very right-wing and traditionalist, and who's actually got a tremendous amount of flack from Ron DeSantis for that, in terms of Ron DeSantis trying to bring in legal big guns to suppress what they're trying to say, which has had the rather unpleasant backfire effect of making Ron DeSantis more unpopular. But yeah, I wanted to mention Disney in this context because I am pleased and impressed with what they did there. I mean, maybe impressed is putting it a little bit high, but I am very, very pleased with what they did there. Right, so HJ, I believe that Peasy, who could not be with us tonight, had a thread on this topic on his blog, which I have barely so far had the chance to glance at, but I believe that he and you mentioned that there were some possible examples on there, so it might be worth just skimming through and seeing what we've got before we go back to examples of our own.
Indeed.
Is this something you can bring up on screen, you mentioned?
Indeed, I can. Let me go over and
Nice, go for
quickly
it.
bring it up. And there we go. You're not going to be able to see it over Zoom and all that, but for the people watching at home, you certainly can see it. I currently
Okay, so I'd
have.
probably better take a look at it myself. Just a second. Um,
Indeed. I'll chatter over while you're bringing it up on this side as well, with some of the early examples that are on there. There's actually a variety of people sort of bringing up some potential examples within the blog itself. Some of them actually sort of caught onto the redemption arc and the sort of relation to fictional. To bring up fictional people who had their own sorts of redemption arcs. Other people sort of did focus on real life examples too, from people on that. On the fictional side, I think one person, for instance, brought up Boromir from Lord of the Rings. And also, yes, Zuko, actually, from Avatar The Last Airbender as well, too. Um, he did start off as a villain within sort of the early episodes of the series, but then sort of gradually transitioned over and realized, no, shoot, I was on the side of evil and all that, and joined up with the protagonist and all that to sort of help defeat the bigger bad who is threatening things who is threatening their society. See, and there are a couple of sort of controversial examples, but to talk about the real life examples, Rob Lowe, for instance, is one that sort of came up with her. Sort of, someone sort of nasty within Hollywood. Sorry, I should give some credit to the people who are sort of promoting this. Rob Lowe was brought up by FtB's. Let's see, Chicago was one of the first ones to bring up Boromir. And Jean McKean, hopefully I got that right, brought up Zuko as well, too, so. Oh, and another fictional example from Brock Ringus, Jean Valjean and Gilbert. Actually, I should probably zoom in a little bit, make it a bit easier to see. Oh yes, Frodo is unintentionally redeemed by Gollum from Robert Jenkins and all that. But anyway, real life examples. There's this Roblo one, which I mentioned from Tethys. Chris Wright brought up a British politician actually in the 1960s. It currently apparently had an affair, then sort of changed his heart and sort of helped promote working for the poor and all that. Although one thing I do note is his problem was that he had an affair, not necessarily that he was sort of opposed to poor people in any sort of way. So he sort of resigned in scandal, but then became a good person after the fact. So it's not really sort of redeeming yourself in the same sense that some of the detransitioners I brought up have a proper redemption arc as well too. So Radana brings up Robert Downey Jr. to some extent. I mean, she mentions that, or they mention, don't know the gender, uh, mentioned that he might have a bit of an ego problem. There are some interesting ones on here. Oh yeah, one that actually caught my eye earlier on was Ray Hill, as mentioned by KG here, former
Mm,
neo-Nazi
had
who,
caught my eye, yes.
uh, and sort of went underground within a lot of neo-Nazi groups, and actually sort of counter espionage against them, and
Mm.
or the authorities helped spawn a bunch of other things. But yeah, there are some.
And
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
and I was going to say there are fictional examples. You've mentioned Boromir, and I've just seen someone's actually mentioned Scrooge, which is obviously a superb example of a fictional character who has a redemption arc.
Indeed, yeah. Yeah. Oh, one actually I should mention as well. Hans Joachim Marcel. I hope I'm spelling that right, or pronouncing that right. I was on the German side, but heard about Auschwitz, and because of that, I actually started to help some POWs. Sort of help rescue some POWs from being sent off to the death camps. So
Hmm.
some of these I think are really good examples. John Newton, for instance, former slaver who became an anti-slavery one. That sort of fits the thing
Hmm.
of actually being, on the bad side and then reverting over to the good.
Hmm.
William Gladstone as well too. From being, in favor, or at least okay with slavery, to being opposed to slavery.
Hmm.
But yeah, one interesting topic that I noticed throughout here, some examples that people brought up were, for instance, like Albrecht Speer. Uh, he was actually, he sort of got some acclaim for sort of, helping turn in fellow Nazis and all that, but there's not really a sign that he actually got like a clear. He actually felt like he had done something wrong and was trying to make up for it. More like he was just trying to sort of save his skin in many ways, or he sort of disagreed with some of the policies, but not nearly all of them. Which
Hmm.
really sort of brings up a good point of just how much do you have to sort of change your views to become someone who has redeemed themselves proper.
Hmm.
Like.
I think it's interesting that I hadn't realised the title of the podcast was actually Redemption Arcs, whereas I've just described it as Know Better, Do Better, and just, examples of people who have improved in some way without it necessarily being dramatic enough an improvement or dramatic enough terrible start to be able to put the label of redemption on it. Uh, so I'm probably looking at a broader set of examples. I mean, I don't know if I would describe Rick Riordan or the other examples I've got in mind as actually needing to redeem themselves, because I thought Rick Riordan's work was excellent anyway, but had these flaws that needed to be better, that could do with being better, and then he actively made them better. Same for like. One or two other examples I've got to show. So yeah, I think redemption arcs is maybe looking at it a bit more narrowly than I would have liked. So I like to look more broadly as has there been improvement? Have people rethought things or actively tried to do things better? And not and for that you don't necessarily have to start out as some sort of terrible stained soul who has to be quote redeemed unquote.
Mhm. That's a very good point. I mean, it's sort of going to the most extreme examples and all that when we don't necessarily have to. And I mean, there's also the whole thing of like, okay, have you sort of there's the whole problematic idea of have you done enough to sort of redeem yourself and get over that line, as you alluded to and all that. Not really sort of the best way to think about it, because it sort of imposes an arbitrary line on this to say, okay, you must do this amount of good to overcome for your bad, when It's
And it also implies that you had to be pretty bad to start with. And it doesn't look at all the people who are just like, actually, perfectly decent people, but there is maybe this thing or that thing that could be better or is a bit problematic and needs looking at and improving, which I think is exactly the case for the Rick Riordan books.
indeed.
Um, I will give you another example, which is actually rather a different one. So this is Diane Duane. Might or might not have ever come across her Young Wizard series. I don't know how to flip the image, so you're seeing all this in mirror image, but it is book 7, I think, of her Young Wizard series, and it's called A Wizard Alone. And the Young Wizard series, for a lot of you who haven't read it, I guess, is a young adult series about children who discover how to get magical powers, and they have to use these to work together with other wizards to improve things in the universe, and basically fight for life and against death. Effectively, very, very good series. Lots of interesting talking points. Absolutely brilliant read. Would definitely recommend it. I think you said, in fact, HJ, that you know a young person who's looking for alternatives, possibly to Harry Potter. Um,
Yes, actually, that would
uh,
be good.
yeah, okay, so it's Young Wizard series, Diane Duane, Duane. Start of the book, So You Want to Be a Wizard.
Gotcha.
Anyway, in this case, what I'm talking about is this specific book, book 7, which is why I was holding that one up, which is a book that features an autistic character. And Dwayne wrote this. I actually have completed, I meant to look up before this started when she actually originally wrote this, but this was really good. Yeah, 2002, so more than 20 years ago, this originally published. And Dwayne had this very the sort of very typical view of autism, that it's this terrible thing, that it's locking children up in this prison of autism, that makes it impossible for them to function properly, and that at the end, the best outcome is for the person not to become autistic. And after a book full of this rather stereotypical presentation, the happy ending is when this character decides that he no longer needs to be autistic and he's going to leave his autism behind. And I don't know how much you know about autistic awareness or autistic rights issues, but this is a, a, a framing that most autistic people would actually very much reject. That autism, being autistic, does not mean, oh no, you're locked in this terrible prison. It means you've got different ways of responding to things and looking at the world and experiencing the world, which can be positives as well as negatives. And in fact, if you get proper acceptance and support and the right accommodations, then you can actually be an autistic person who's doing splendidly. And uh, also, autism isn't something that's separate from you, that autistic people would necessarily want to get rid of. For most autistic people, it's just part of who you are if you're autistic. And it's like being gay, being an art lover. It's something that's part of you. It's not something you see as something you want to get rid of. And autistic people get very, very fed up with this whole idea of, let's cure autism and let's get rid of the autism and find the normal person who's behind all this terrible autism. So all of this, looking back on it from 21 years later, is very well meant on Diane Duane's part, but actually not really such a good way of presenting autism. And here's the lovely thing: in a later edition, Duane recognised this and rewrote the book. I haven't read the updated one, but I've read a description of what she changed, and she basically just rewrote huge chunks of it to have a much more positive portrayal and to change the ending so that now the boy is quite happy being autistic and doesn't see any need to leave it behind because it's part of who he is. So I'm just so impressed by the fact that here is someone who I love as an author anyway, without even needing this, but she was actually willing, once she realized that she had unintentionally and well-meaningly screwed up her portrayal of autistic people, she was willing to just rewrite huge parts of a book. That is really pretty cool, don't you think?
Very cool. Yes.
Well,
Yeah.
I like it. So shout out to Diane Duane. Thank you.
Hmm.
Right, now let's see. I think we'll be getting pretty close to the end, and I don't know if you had more things you wanted to discuss or more thoughts, but I know there was one that, in fact, is very similar to a case that we touched on in PZ's thread, that you had this very interesting sounding taste you knew quite a bit about. But I'm also wondering, I don't want to cut you off, so have you got any others that you were going to mention that, or any others in PZ's thread that you think we should look at, uh, that we haven't already been through?
Well, there was actually one that I thought of outside of PZ's thread and all that, and it's because
Mm.
I sort of inadvertently crossed paths with them a couple of years ago, inadvertently thanks to Sam Harris of all people. Um, the name of the person in question is, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, but it's Picolucci. Sorry, Piccolini, I believe. Yeah, Christian Piccolini. He actually was sort of a really rough kid. I think he mentions at one point he was kicked out of like 6 high schools and all that. At around the age of 14, he joined a skinhead group.
Oof.
Yeah, and also became a musician as well too, and got all the necessary tattoos and all that, the sort of Nordic runes and all that to indicate that you're part of the white power movement. Spread the music around through Europe and all that. Really sort of helped recruit people into the neo-Nazi movement just by being, a fairly charismatic sort of singer and all that.
Mm.
Um, Started to get second thoughts a little bit when he was off in Europe and beat the crap out of a black person. Sort of went, what the hell am I doing with my life, essentially? Also opened up a record store and all that, which caused him to sort of meet some of the people he openly hated and sort of slowly realize that, well, hang on, shoot, they were human beings too. Eventually, he had a marriage with someone who was fairly progressive and all that, but he was still a little bit too deep. While he was trying to pull himself out of this neo-Nazi movement, he was still not quite out. And a lot of people around him sort of recognized him as a Nazi and all that, and even would sort of deliberately come into the record store to sort of, do wares because they knew they were helping to benefit a neo-Nazi. And so he actually spent some time sort of, post divorce, trying to go underground and hide himself and all that. And it was sort of under the advice of a friend or something like that. He actually got a job installing computers for IBM, of all people. Had sort of a chance encounter there where he met one of the people who he just absolutely terrorized at an old high school and all that, and sort of reconnected. Sort of told the guy his life story, and the other person, sort of went from terror to being like, oh shoot, this, it's great to sort of see you redeeming yourself. Keep talking about these stories. And he has since sort of gone on to sort of keep talking to other people like him, who young angry kids and all that, who were sort of likely to buy into the sort of lies and some of the seduction of the neo-Nazi movement a lot, and try and help get people out. He's since founded an
Mm.
organization to help. He briefly got onto a TED Talk, which of course got him on the radar of Sam Harris, and spun out that story as well too. But yes, he's been working for I think at least the past 10 or so years, at least that anyway, to try and de-radicalize people who were interested in joining the neo-Nazi movement himself.
And
Yeah.
that is an excellent story. So someone who was going down a pretty dark path in life not only pulled himself out of it, but has just actively used his experience since then to help stop other people from going down that same dark path.
Mhm.
And unless you had anything else to say, I think that one's a good note to end on, just as a reminder of how people can turn around, how people can change, and how what can any of us do to change, rethink our views, be better about them. Never too
Indeed.
late.
Yeah.
So, a bit earlier than usual, but we've got fewer people than usual. So I don't know if you've got any other examples or really just anything you want to say to sum up.
Well, I do actually have an interesting thing from chat as well too. Hemi Scott sort of brought up the notion of Himmat Matha. And I mean, Himmat Matha, yeah, has sort of been problematic in some sense. I mean, I sort of know him from sort of the that brief period where the atheist skeptic movement sort of had like a reasonable amount of popularity and all that.
Mm,
He was sort of this. My impression of him, rightly or wrongly, and all that, was sort of like a gatekeeping sort of centrist who didn't really sort of want to sort of deal with any controversies and all that, and really sort of tended to side with sort of the sort of right leaning reactionary kinds in sort of vague ways, but not sort of outright sort of coming in and saying that he was within their type and all that. You know, at best he was a problematic ally. At worst, he was very much sort of kind of one of these sort of centrist pundits in some ways who talk a good line, but really sort of shade people towards, the conservative sort of angle and all that. And actually, it sort of led me to sort of stop paying attention to him for a long time. But more recently, especially with the satanic panic, which is going on against transgender people, he's actually been a lot more outspoken and actually critiquing things. Like, for instance, when Richard Dawkins had posted his series of articles, for instance, sort of defending, some levels of transphobia and all that, he was quite vocal to sort of push back, even though, I mean, Dawkins is still widely respected within the atheist-skeptic movement. Yeah, and so definitely kudos to that. He sort of went from somebody I had kind of written off and all that to somebody who's actually sort of working to do at least good in some ways. Certainly fitting into the sort of small R redemption side of things.
mm.
So,
Thank you for that example. Also, thanks HJ for checking the chat, which I didn't have a chance to do until now. And I'm delighted to see there are two people watching. So there we go. We didn't quite get as far as the watchers outnumbering the participants, but we at least got equal numbers, which was, more than I'd hoped for. So thank you, you guys. Right. And anything else you wanted to say before we close?
no, let's do sort of our social closings. And then once you sort of give me the final word, I'll cue the music and cue us out of here.
Mm. So, okay. So, uh, HJ, do you want to give a quick shout out to your blog before we go, since that's our tradition?
Indeed. I blog on Reprobate Spreadsheet. I keep meaning to write blog posts, but I keep getting distracted by other things. My workload's kind of crushing right now, so I apologize for
Mm.
being as silent as I am. I tend to be a little bit more active on our Mastodon thing, freethought.online. So it's certainly a better spot to sort of get an idea of what I'm up and thinking about. Although even there, I tend to be pretty quiet. I'm just quiet in general. Sorry about that. Yeah, those are the two best
Um,
spots to see me.
mm. And I'm Dr. Sarah from Geeky Humanist, where from the things I've been talking about in this show, you'll probably not be too surprised to hear that I like doing book reviews, and so that is what I mostly do over there. When I get a chance to do anything, because like HJ, I have a workload and a lot of things to be reckoned with, but yeah, I'm a Geeky Humanist. So thank you for watching, those of you who are watching, and we will see you all next month on the second Saturday of next month. HJ, take it away. Good night, everyone.
We shall. Bye bye, everyone.